Hey, what's up guys, it's Nick2. Today I'm going to be bringing you guys an updated Hammer of the Ancients Barbarian build. This is probably one of the single best builds in the entire game, let alone one of the best builds for Barbarian. It is unbelievably powerful, from having ridiculous amounts of survivability through literally like 5 different sources of damage reduction, having unstoppable so you can pretty much never get CC'd, having unbelievable amounts of damage to not only just one-shot massive packs of elites, but literally one-shot bosses. And to top it all off, you are permanently almost at movement speed cap. This build is unbelievably powerful, and like I mentioned, it is probably one of the best builds in the entire game. This build is easily able to clear nightmare dungeons literally 20 levels higher than you, not even level 100 with full Paragon Board, etc. It is actually insane how good this build is, and if you're having a hard time on Barbarian, I would highly recommend checking this out. There's not really a whole lot else to say. As you can see from the gameplay, the build is just unbelievably strong. If you like seeing massive numbers on your screen and playing one of the best builds in the entire game, this is a build for you. Full transparency here, this build was made by a good friend of mine, but I helped him a ton with the theory crafting process, setting up the best legendaries, skill tree, etc. But I am going to be using gameplay from him, and all the footage is going to be from him. Let's just jump into the build. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe. There's like 90% of you guys aren't subscribed. It would help me out a ton. Bigger number, better person. Maybe I can impress some girls or something in 10 years when I decide to leave my house. Anyways, the entirety of the build will be on the website, so if you want to be able to reference the skills, the skill points, the best legendaries, the entirety of the Paragon board, make sure to check out the website link in the description. So when it comes to skills here, for a basic skill, we're going to be using Lunging Strike. Lunging Strike is just the best with this build because it literally lunges you forward. It just gives you a crazy amount of mobility, but we also have really high critical strike chance with this build, so this gives us a pretty good uptime on additional berserking for the extra damage and the movement speed that we get from this. It really just speeds up the gameplay, but you also get a lot of fury generation with Lunging Strike, so pretty much just perfect for the build. And then obviously we are going to be using Hammer of the Ancients here as our core skill. Because this is a Hammer of the Ancients build, we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, but Hammer of the Ancients just does a crazy amount of damage. One of his legendaries makes it clear out the whole map pretty much, and you can scale the damage pretty much indefinitely, so it is an incredibly powerful skill. For our next 3 skills, we're just going to be using Shouts because you pretty much have to if you want this build to even function. Shouts are unbelievably powerful for a number of different reasons. I could talk about why the Shouts are good for literally 20 minutes because they are that powerful, and I'm very jealous of Barbarian because I would love to have that on my rogue. For the last skill, I think this is probably the only one that's interchangeable. We're using the ultimate here. The cooldown is pretty long, so I don't think it's like insane. This is really just good for giving you a crazy amount of extra damage and just nuking massive packs of elites or literally one-shotting bosses. If you wanted to use like Leap for mobility, or there's a certain skill that you really like using, I mean, there's not a ton of options here, but Wrath of the Berserker is just good to have, right? There's not really a lot else. Feel free to swap it out if you want. Getting into the skill tree here, pretty basic. We're going to be maxing out Lunging Strike and getting the Berserking there. And we're going to max out Hammer of the Ancients, obviously. One of the better parts of Hammer of the Ancients is getting the additional Fury generation based on how many enemies that you hit, so you just get a whole bunch of extra Fury, which is quite nice. But the main thing that we are scaling here is Hammer does more damage based on each point of Fury that you had when using it. So you can basically scale up your maximum Fury through Paragon, through your gear, etc., and get upwards of like 200 additional Fury, which literally makes it do 200% multiplicative increased damage. So you can scale it really high, and the higher level that you get, the better gear that you get, the better that Hammer of the Ancients gets. Another good part about Hammer of the Ancients has a 50% lucky hit chance. We're not using much lucky hit oriented things with this build, but that's just really nice to have, especially when more things get discovered later down the line. But also one of the legendaries makes it do AoE, so you can just, clear out massive packs of mobs, and it's just a very consistent high damage skill, and obviously it is the cornerstone of the build. Speaking of lucky hit, one of the only lucky hit mechanics we're taking advantage of is Pressure Point. Your core skills being our Hammer has a chance to make enemies vulnerable. We pretty much only use this against bosses because against normal packs of mobs we have the exploit glyph for vulnerable, but Pressure Point is pretty much mandatory if you're doing like really tanky long boss fights. And then we're going to go into Rallying Cry for Tactical Rallying Cry just to give us additional resource generation. Then Challenging Shout is insane for the damage reduction, and you also get extra Fury while it's active, so that pairs very nicely with the build because we spend a lot of Fury, so we really need to generate as much as possible. And then we go into Warcry. Warcry isn't like insane. It's nice for the berserking, and it's nice for the additional damage here, but it's pretty much just to have an additional shout. You could alternatively, instead of getting the 10% extra damage, go for the extra Fortify, but we have near permanent Fortify with one of our legendaries, which we'll talk more about in a second. Then you want to buff your shout's duration, and then also make enemies deal less damage to you After you use a shout skill, which is pretty insane. You have so much survivability with this build, and that is a lot of it right there. And then you get a lot of healing through Raid Leader while your shouts are active, which is pretty much all the time you're just healing, and this is per shout. So you heal just 2 points of this, 6% of your HP per second. You could throw a third point in here, but we don't really have all the points. Aggressive resistance is another way you could get even more damage reduction, but we only got 1 point because we want the extra Fury gen here. But if you feel like your Fury gen is fine, you could go into that for the additional survivability. Fit Fighter is just great for extra damage. And then No Mercy here, which we even have 1 point of on our amulet. Our amulet is bugged, so that's really nice, but you can get up to 6 points on this. This is 12% increased crit chance against immobilized, stunned, or slowed. And we are slowing enemies every single time that we hit them instantaneously because we are applying a bleed, and then pairing that with Hamstring for the bleeding effect is going to slow enemies. So we pretty much permanently have 9% crit chance against enemies that aren't bosses, and crit is very good. And if you get that on the amulet, that is 18% crit chance. That is insane. That I can't even state how good that is, just having that for free. But also, a slow counts as crowd controlled, so you also gain damage versus crowd controlled if you have that in your Paragon board, on your gear. You just get that literally for free. Then we go 1 point thick skin, and then 3 points into counter offensive, so we deal 12% increased damage, while we have fortify over 50%, which we have pretty much all the time with this build, because we have pretty insane fortify generation with one of our legendaries. Then we get heavy-handed here, 15% increased crit damage, as multiplicative is crazy just by using a two-handed weapon. We have really high crit with this build, so this is fantastic. You can even get 3 additional points of this on the amulet as well, instead of No Mercy. And then we also get 3 points into Wallop for 15% increased damage if the enemy is stunned or vulnerable. And then we go into Tempered Fury for 9 extra Fury. This is one of the points where you could probably swap this out and go for more survivability-oriented things, because 9 is a lot when you're starting out, but later on into the build, when you have more optimized gear and your Paragon is filled out, 9 is a pretty small percentage. And we just max out the Wrath of the Berserker ultimate, because that's what we're using, but again, you could put on like Leap or something if you prefer it. Wrath of the Berserker is just nice, because it just gives you a crazy amount of extra damage, and you're spending a lot of Fury, so you're just instantly increasing your Berserk. And then Unbridled Rage, obviously, we want to do as much damage as possible, and we are going to spend a lot of Fury, but we're also generating a crazy amount of Fury as well. So this is perfect for us. Now let's talk about the Legendaries. So the 2 most important Legendaries for this entire build to function is going to be the Shout ones. These are very hard to get. I would recommend saving up all the obols that you ever collect and gambling on rings, okay? My friend here has only ever looted these twice, and he still has one of them at the minimum roll. One of them he has not looted, but this Bold Chieftains, whenever you cast a Shout skill, its cooldown is reduced, but it goes up to a maximum of 6 seconds. So this works for each shout that you have. Since we have 3, you can reduce it by 18 seconds. So this is pretty much what allows you to have good uptime on your shouts, which you need to have enough Fury to actually play with the build. So spend your obols, try to get that. And then the next one that you also need, which my friend has at literally the minimum roll, it'd be twice as good if he had an actual good roll here. But your shout skills generate 2 Fury per second, and we're constantly spamming our shouts. And we have 3 of them, so this is 6 Fury per second, but if you have this at the max roll, that would be 12 Fury per second, so you just have infinite Fury generation just from these 2 things, and then you just try to lower the cooldown on your shouts as much as possible, and that's pretty much what allows the build to function. These are the 2 most important legendaries by a massive stretch. Then our next most important legendary, which we put on a 2-hander, is called Limitless Rage. Each point of Fury that we generate while at max grants our core skill increased damage. We just constantly scale this up, so we just do a whole bunch of extra damage. So that just synergizes very well with the build, and pretty much means that you definitely want to have a good ring roll, right? Because that'll just keep your Fury generation up. And then we have the, I don't know what this is called, Ancestral Force, I guess. It's the Hammer of the Ancients, makes it into a Quake. You might actually want this on a 2-hander, not 100% sure. This is the only good roll that my friend has ever gotten, so we're keeping it. But basically this turns Hammer into an AoE spell, and it just makes it really good at map clearing. Fantastic way to make the build really function. These are the 3 things that or 4 things really that you need for the build to work. Everything else is kind of just extra, so Expectant works very well, because anytime we use our basic skill, increases the damage of our next core skill. So this is basically 10% extra damage, because we're constantly doing Lunging Strike into Hammer, into Lunging Strike into Hammer, because Lunging Strike gives us all the Fury, and we also get all of the stuff with our glyphs, the crit chance and the extra damage, so that is really, really good. Just a whole bunch of extra damage with this, and every once in a while you'll press your Lunging Strike multiple times to generate Fury, so that's good. When it comes to our amulet and our 2-hander here, we actually have Edge Masters on the amulet. I would recommend most people put this on the 2-hander. My friend could not get another roll of this, so we put it on the amulet, so we have 30% increased damage based on our resource, and we're pretty much maxed out on Fury every time we press Hammer, so that's really good. And then Accelerating Aspect, which is something not a lot of people use. On the two-hander, this is crazy because it gives you so much attack speed, which just speeds up the build. You have so much raw damage, you're hitting for like 20 million all the time. You have so much raw damage, it's almost unnecessary to put Edge Masters on the two-hander. You definitely can, but Accelerating Aspect just makes that lunging strike hammer combo twice as fast. You know, you just and it just speeds up the gameplay a crazy amount. I would definitely recommend putting this on the Amulet and then Edge Masters on the two-hander. My friend got a bad roll here, but if this is on the Amulet, this is like 38% attack speed, so that's literally as good as it is for this roll right here. But if you like the attack speed, 50% on your two-hander is pretty insane. Then we have the Fortify Legendary. Each point of Fury generated while at max just gives you Fortify. We're constantly doing that, so that really just helps with our Fortify generation. When it comes to the chest piece, you could decide to use the Rage of Harrogath unique, but we aren't using that, which means that we gain a defensive legendary, but also we gain 4 ranks of Challenging Shout and also all the stats on the chest piece, which is a lot of damage reduction. So personally, I would prefer to not use that unique, but feel free to if you want. It's a very good damage decision. But defensively, using a legendary and then putting Disobedience on it is crazy. That gives you armor cap basically when it's stacked up. Really, really good. Then we have Berserk Ripping, so we guarantee apply bleed all the time, so we can take advantage of damage reduction versus bleed, and Hamstring for the slow, and then for the crit, etc. Pretty much mandatory for the build. And then we have Aspect of Might for the 20% damage reduction after we use a basic skill, which is pretty insane. And then on the boots, we just have While Unstoppable, you gain extra movement speed. This is kind of overkill for the movement speed. There's another legendary that increases your berserking uptime if you land a crit, but it's lucky hit based. But that would proc pretty much all the time with Hammer. I would recommend most people use that for berserking uptime. But again, all the legendaries will be listed on the website, so make sure to check out the website. When it comes to the rolls on each piece on the helmet, you want to go for maximum fury and cooldown reduction. Those are the 2 most important things. Outside of that, I would recommend like maximum HP, armor percentage, and then strength is pretty good, or all stats. But the maximum fury is so much damage, and the cooldown reduction is pretty much a must. On the chest piece, again, you could use the unique, but if you use the unique, you miss out on 4 ranks of Challenging Shout, which just gives you a lot of damage reduction. You miss out on damage reduction from close, or total armor percent and just straight up damage reduction. So you miss out on a lot of damage reduction stuff. So I think the Rage of Harrogath chest is great offensively if you're doing easier content, but if you're doing harder content and you want to be pushing Nightmare Dungeons or fighting mobs that are way higher level than you, a legendary chest with a more defensive legendary is definitely your best bet. And then on the gloves, you want to go for ranks to Hammer of the Ancients first, and then crit chance, and then attack speed. And then outside of that, you want to get just strength or all stats is probably your best thing, but the crit chance and the ranks to Hammer is pretty much mandatory. When it comes to the pants, there's a ton of really good defensive stuff you can get. Most importantly, you want straight up damage reduction, and then you want damage reduction from close, and then you can get like damage reduction while fortified, against while you were injured, from distant enemies, etc. Again, on the website we will have a priority list. You can also get ranks to Warcry, but it only increases the damage by like 5%, so I don't think that is really all that necessary. But if you want more damage, feel free to do that. But the damage reduction stuff you can get from the pants is just too valuable to pass up. So then on the boots here, you can get some pretty crazy stuff on the boots. The main thing you want is berserking duration, because you can hit 30%, so this just increases how long berserking is going to last, which really just smooths out the playstyle. And then instead of movement speed after killing an elite, you would actually want fury cost reduction. I think you get like 20%. He spent like a lot of gold on this, so it's really hard to get. Outside of that, damage reduction while injured and movement speed is probably what you're going to want to go for. So this pair of boots is pretty much perfect if we could get the fury cost reduction there. That's really nice. And then the evade giving you movement speed is a little overkill. You probably want to go for multiple evades just so you can dodge through stuff, but that's like a minor optimization. When it comes to the weapons here, you're pretty much forced to use a bludgeoning weapon and a two-handed sword. On these weapons, you want it to roll. Unfortunately, the bludgeoning weapon always has overpower, which kind of sucks, but you want it to roll, this is literally perfect, vulnerable damage, strength, crit damage, and then damage to close. But vulnerable damage, crit damage, strength are the 3 most important. I'd probably rank vulnerable damage the most important, crit the second, and strength the third. And then damage to close or damage with your core skill is going to be the last stat that you want in there, which is really good. For your one-handers, I would recommend using 2 swords here. Axes aren't that bad, but swords, as you can see, have crit damage. You can get that twice, while axes have damage to healthy, and the value isn't very high here. So I definitely recommend getting 2 swords, and then again, you want the same stats, crit damage, vuln, crit, and then unfortunately this doesn't have strength on it. Damage to crowd control is okay, but it's not good as core skill or damage to close. Again, priority list is on the website. This sword here is really, really good, and then this two-handed sword is pretty much perfect, right? Crit, core skill, crit, strength, vulnerable, literally amazing. And then when it comes to the rings, he has 2 god roll rings. You can get so much damage from these rings. You want crit chance first, that's the most important. Then you want vulnerable damage, crit damage, and then maximum fury or some orientation of that. The maximum fury is great because it scales your hammer of the ancients up, obviously. If you can't get maximum fury, getting maximum life is really good survivability. Or you could get fury generation, which scales how much fury you get from your shouts and stuff, so that is really nice. He literally has 2 rings that are perfect. This just gives you so much damage. When it comes to the amulet, there's a lot of different stuff you can get. The 2 most important things is getting cooldown reduction and then ranks to defensive skills, because your challenging shout and your war cry are actually defensive skills here. As you can see, challenging shout is defensive, and so is war cry. So getting ranks to those is going to be really, really nice. I actually wouldn't say that that's mandatory, but I do think that it is pretty nice. No Mercy is great for damage because it gives you extra crit chance. This amulet, I'm pretty sure, is bugged out because it just couldn't get to 3 ranks, which doesn't make any sense. Should at least have gotten to 2 ranks, and we tried to reroll it, and it just won't work. But you want cooldown reduction. Mandatory ranks to defensive skills is nice, but I don't think it scales the cooldown, so that's actually not as mandatory as I was thinking. And then getting a damage passive is probably really good. And you can also get damage reduction. The 2 damage passives that you want, one of them I already mentioned, is No Mercy for the crit chance, which I think is the best one because you have it active pretty much all the time, just won't be active against bosses. And then the next one is Heavy Handed, so you deal 15% multiplicative crit damage, so you get another 15% that's on the amulet. That is really good. Outside of that, damage reduction from distant, damage reduction from close, movement speed, and strength percent are really good rolls. When it comes to the gems here, not sure we really showed it, but on the pants or like any piece of armor, I believe these are sapphires for damage reduction while fortified. If you're getting killed in a stun a lot, I'd recommend topazes, but you have permanent unstoppable almost with this build if you have the right shout stuff, because your shouts are always up, which gives you unstoppable. So you pretty much don't need the damage reduction with topazes. You want it while fortified, when we're fortified pretty much all the time, but feel free to use topazes instead. When it comes to the weapons, you want the crit damage to vulnerable because that's insane. Enemies are always vulnerable, so that's a ton of extra crit damage. We have 4 weapons. And then the jewelry, you just want skulls for the armor. When it comes to our technique here, we want to be using 2-handed axes for the 15% increased damage to vulnerable enemies. Alternatively, if you don't have the aspect of berserk ripping, you could swap this to sword so that you guarantee apply bleed all the time, and it isn't conditional on you being berserking, although you should be berserking all the time. But if you're just transitioning into this build and you don't have a lot of the key parts to it yet, I would recommend putting this on first and then freeing up one of your legendary slots and not using berserk ripping, and you just miss out on a little bit of damage, but then you pretty much permanently have the bleed, which I think is a pretty good alternative to the build, right? When it comes to the Paragon board, this character is not level 100, so it's a little bit scuffed and a lot of the glyphs aren't leveled up. On the website, I will have a leveling Paragon board and a level 100 Paragon board, so you guys know exactly what you want to do. On the first board here, if you're leveling, you need to put Exploit in as soon as humanly possible, because Exploit gives you not only damage to vulnerable, but it makes enemies instantaneously vulnerable, the most broken glyph or broken thing in the game, in my opinion. You just don't have to worry about vulnerable anymore, and vulnerable is the best source of damage in the game. Because this character is really high level, he's able to put Exploit in a different board, which we'll talk about in a second. So we have Territorial in here, which is just good for the damage reduction. The damage to close isn't insane, but getting the damage reduction is super nice. There's a couple damage nodes on here, but it's not all that important. The next board is really important. I think this is the Warbinger board. Warbinger is probably right. There's a ton of maximum fury on this board, and then you can also get Wrath, which is probably one of the better ones. He needs to level this up ASAP because crit damage with core skills is insane, and skills that crit generate 3 fury for just better fury uptime, but you mainly want this because crit damage is an incredibly good multiplier here, so that's a lot of extra damage. And then there's even more maximum fury here, which just adds up to a ton of extra damage. The next board is Weapons Master. We can get a little bit of like damage to elites down here, and then you put in Mortal Draw. Mortal Draw is really nice because we're constantly swapping weapons. So when we use our Lunging Strike, it's a different weapon than when we use our hammer, and that's going to increase our crit chance on our hammer after using the Lunging Strike by 18%. So 18% crit chance all the time, and we gain 71% extra damage just from doing that. So your gameplay is Lunging Strike, hammer, Lunging Strike, hammer, and your hammer is going to have a ton of extra crit and a ton of extra damage just from doing that. And there's also some legendaries that synergize very well. The next board is the Martial board. This is literally just so that we get additional cooldown reduction on our shouts. It's a little bit weak, honestly, but you pretty much need it if you want good uptime on the shouts. The other stuff on the board is pretty useless, like You put it in this board so that you get extra vulnerable damage and damage reduction, but it's really not that good. This board is just nice because it has a lot of vulnerable damage on it, so just free extra damage, and you guys know how much I like vulnerable damage. On the next board, you want to get Exploit. Again, put this in the first one if you are still leveling up, but around level like 80 or something, you can put it in this board up here. Again, it'll be on the website. I don't know all the names. Exploit is insane. Not going to talk about it. Guaranteed vulnerable and extra vulnerable damage. And for the last board before everything is filled out, I forget what it's called, but there's a ton of crit damage on this one. And then you get the damage while fortified glyph. And it also gives you 10% damage reduction based on the amount of fortified that you have. So you just have a lot of extra damage reduction with this, which is fantastic. That's pretty much it for the build. It's unbelievably powerful. As you can see, clearing nightmare dungeons literally 20 tiers above you and one-shotting bosses is pretty insane. And there's a lot of room for improvement here, especially hitting level 100, etc. But anyways, hopefully you guys did enjoy. If you did, please make sure to drop a like, subscribe for more builds, etc. And make sure to check out the website and check me out on Twitch. Thank you guys for watching, and I will see you guys later.